Voters head to the polls in just 6 weeks, but as we all know, a lot can happen in that short amount of time. Right now, much depends on the battleground states like Pennsylvania. The latest NBC News Marist poll finds President Trump is losing ground in Pennsylvania. The poll gives Joe Biden a 9-point lead over the president, 53 to 44% with likely voters. Among suburban voters, Biden beats President Trump by 19 points. Back in 2016, Trump won the suburbs by 8 points.
And with me now is GOP strategist Rob Bickhart. He is the president and CEO of the Capital Resource Group in Harrisburg. He worked with the Reagan administration and former Pennsylvania Senators Arlen Specter and Rick Santorum. Also with us today, Spencer Critchley. He is the author of Patriots of Two Nations: Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. You work for the Obama campaign as a communications consultant. Welcome to both of you to the show. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so there is a lot to get to, a lot to talk about. Rob, I'm going to begin with you. I want to talk about this NBC Marist poll. The numbers at this point, not so much in the president's favor here in Pennsylvania. Some say Pennsylvania is a must-win state. What does the president have to do here?
Pennsylvania is a tough state. Everybody knows it's going to be a tough campaign in Pennsylvania. When you take a look at where the president has been and specifically the vice president, they're spending an enormous amount of time in the western part of Pennsylvania, which are vote rich for this president. And that's why you see him in Washington and Westmoreland, Forest, and Greene counties. So I think there's a lot of campaign to go. The polls are all over the place. I know the Marist NBC poll has the vice president up, but Susquehanna has it a lot closer, and so does Quinnipiac. So right now, I think we've got a lot of campaign to get to.
I agree. Pennsylvania is very important. It's one of the most important battleground states, and I'm sure these numbers are making the Trump campaign very nervous. And I think even more so, though, because they're sophisticated enough to know that just one poll doesn't make the difference, but the pattern of the polling has been very consistent for months. Sometimes you'll see Biden up a little more, sometimes you'll see Trump climbing a bit. But if you look at like the Real Clear Politics average over time, for example, it's very stable with an outside the margin of error lead for Biden. I would caution people, though, on my side, not to get too optimistic about that, because it's like the stock market. Past performance is no guarantee of future results.
Right, absolutely. You know, Spencer, the president also continues to pound Democratic controlled states on his, tough on crime and safety message. Is that, do you think, going to hurt when it comes to states like Michigan and Wisconsin?
President Trump, of course, wants to talk about this fabricated Democrat-run cities violence problem because he wants to talk about anything other than the coronavirus and his bungling of that, which has cost literally tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths. And now the last thing he wants to talk about is being on tape confessing that he's been lying to the American people about that. And of course, he wants to avoid talking about his contempt for military service, also undeniably true. So he wants to cook up this story about violence when, in fact, the violent crime rate has been falling in cities since the early 90s, and we're now safer in cities than we have been in a very, very long time. And the turmoil that you see on America's streets today, believe it or not, President Trump, you're the president. It's happening during your presidency. If you're running against this, you're running against yourself.
I think you'd have a hard time convincing the people of Portland and Seattle and Kenosha and in our own city of Philadelphia that the problems of this summer were not real. I spent 25 years working in Parkside to rebuild that community, and what happened there is just simply tragic. And the idea that we would blame that on the president for some reason is ludicrous. I see this as a much bigger issue. I think this is playing exactly the way, from a strategic perspective, exactly what we have to do. I think under a Biden presidency, America would be less safe. I think we've seen this in state after state and city after city.
What the president likes to describe as terrifying riots led by these phantom Antifa activists are almost
Who
entirely
are exactly
peaceful.
who are leading the riots.
And this has been studied, and it's way over 90% of these protests are peaceful, but they're unfailingly described as violent riots with heavy racial overtones. And nobody is in favor of this lawless behavior, except I sometimes suspect President Trump, who seems to be doing everything he can to provoke it with his heavy-handed, militarized response. This is something that Republicans, or certainly conservatives, I'm not sure what Republicans are anymore, conservatives should be deeply alarmed at the federalization of law enforcement and sending troops in to do domestic law enforcement. If this had been happening under the Obama administration or any Democratic administration, people would rightly be losing their minds over it. But
I think if the leadership in those cities had responded the way they should respond,
it's not working.
And to rise to this,
demonstrably not working. It's demonstrably failing. President Trump inherited a far safer, more peaceful country, just like he inherited a stronger economy. He's good at inheriting things and tearing them to pieces.
Let's turn back to the election. I want to talk about undecided voters. The president is very good at reaching his base. His base is solid, but is he doing enough to bring in those undecided voters at this point?
Oh, no.
I think that's a really good point.
The hell out of them.
I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that this president has done well to sort of build on what Spencer just suggested. I mean, over the last 4 years, I mean, the president, we had the best economy in 50 years before COVID. We had an unemployment rate that was the lowest in 50 years. We became the largest exporter of oil and natural gas. We're no longer dependent on OPEC. I just think the president, Republicans and especially conservative Republicans are tired of the same old tried and true tactics from both the Democrats and the Republicans, which is one of the reasons why President Trump has been so successful.
He slowed down employment growth. He slowed down economic growth. If you look at the curve, there's 7 years of recovery from the catastrophe of 2008. Under Obama, that curve continues with Trump, but it slows down. Meanwhile, he jacked up the debt enormously, giving tax breaks to rich people and corporations.
Spencer, 4 million jobs created since 2016.
Yeah, it would have been.
I have a hard time arguing with those numbers. The president has done a good job. Joe Biden is a flawed candidate. I don't think the people in the primaries ever voted for Joe Biden because they were compelled by his philosophical or his political positions. They ended up deciding that Joe Biden would be the best guy to beat Donald Trump and they forced themselves to the left. This is a problem they're going to have to dig out of as we move into this campaign, and I think they're going to regret it. And I don't know that Joe Biden is the right guy to play that game with this president. I think he's a flawed candidate, and the mess that we've seen over the last 4 months in the cities in America has been tragic by any standard. The economic conditions are growing. To watch from unemployment go from 14.7 to 8.4 in August is exciting and dynamic, and I think that's the way this campaign is going to go.
Yeah,
I think anybody that thinks this campaign is over is delusional.
We're almost halfway back up the cliff that President Trump threw us off, and they call that on.
I have a hard time believing the American people are going to blame this virus on the president.
They will blame him for bungling it and costing them so many lives. And
gentlemen, we're going to have you guys both back because we are flat out of time. Thank you so much, Rob Bickhart,
Thanks,
Spencer. Thank you so much for being here.
You.